So today I'm just going to give out to you a collection of ideas about fire and NRM. It's intended to spark a rethink about the way we think about fire. And I've only got 12 minutes of your time, so let's go. And I just actually was going to talk without slides, so these slides have been put together really quickly. So, yes, that's what we're doing. I'm going to throw out some ideas. Just as a background, fire is very easy to start. It doesn't take a lot of expertise, really. I mean, I know it does now because things are getting more sophisticated in management of fire in the landscape. But I just wanted to outline that it has both destructive and restorative impacts. And that's known around the world. Civilizations for generations have revered fire and have associated customary practices to recognise that it's a very powerful force. It's a risky business. So just to outline some of the management tensions between the use of fire for ecological purposes. These were just some I thought off the top of my head. You'll probably have others. So on one hand, it's a threatening process. On the other hand, it's used to restore environments. There's a policy to reduce carbon emissions, but we know that a lot of bushfires actually burn up a lot of fuel and biomass. Even in the Northern Territory, where the fire abatement program is designed to limit big fires, there's still more carbon being released from that program than there was before. There's also a huge policy about soil carbon. There's nothing in the soil carbon policies about fire, even though we know that fire ignites and burns up biomass and organic matter. And there's consequences about that. There's also the issue about fire and smoke and asthma and so on. And the use of fire by land managers for ecological purposes versus emergency services. So just to start off with, I think my question way back was, when is it a good time to burn? And that actually was a leading question. I don't think it's the right question because it automatically says good, when. You could also, and you're probably thinking there, oh, the timing, the frequency, I can tell you when it's good to burn at these times for these purposes. But it's a leading question, and I'd like to rethink that title. Perhaps it should be not when, but if it is a good time to burn, and also if it is bad to burn. It's all about terminology, and the language in this space, which is the point of this overhead, is about the influence that terminology language can have on the way we think. And it explains why certain directions are taken and why certain decisions are made. So that's language. Now, some of the assumptions also, I'm just throwing out ideas here. You might not like them, you might love them. It doesn't really matter. It's only 12 minutes. So assumptions about, you hear all the time, Australian vegetation is a result of fire regimes. Well, if you look at the literature, it's established a long time ago, and it's been re-established by scientists recently looking back into that data, that topography, rainfall and soil and climate are the main drivers of vegetation, not fire. Fire happens, but it isn't the main reason why plant communities grow in certain places. It's a stochastic force. It's like cyclones and tsunamis. Prior to humans on the planet, fire was relatively rare. It was from ignition sources such as lightning. And it is a driver. It does shape, there's no doubt about that. It does have a major impact. But it isn't one of the underlying main drivers of Australian vegetation. We hear all the time, Australian bush is adapted to fire. If I had $1 every time somebody said that, I'd be wealthy. It's not adapted, it's tolerant. The plants that we see here are the ones that have been able to withstand a certain amount of fire. And there's a difference between adaptation and tolerance. The more fire, the more selection pressure there is for traits that can withstand fire. And like in grasslands, there's a very high fire regime and they're very tolerant traits. Some areas of Australia have had more pressure and therefore have more tolerant vegetation types. But overall, the whole country, there's a lot of country where there's a lot of fire-sensitive vegetation which has escaped fire. And that's especially so in southern Australia as compared to northern Australia, where there's a lot more lightning and a lot more fire-tolerant flora. Another comment that you hear a lot is Australian plants need fire. Well, it depends. If you can see this guy called Horton, he wrote this amazing 10-point submission to a parliamentary inquiry. And when I read that a couple of years ago when I was preparing a talk on this subject, I just went, oh my God, this guy's already done it. He really, really well explains why debunks some of these myths and questions the assumptions. And you know, even as recently as 2005, you know, Dave Bowman said there are very few examples that demonstrate the evolution of specific features that enable plants to survive fire. Some plants have some traits that enable them to withstand some fire some of the time, and those are the ones that are selected for. But all the rest either get stressed and drop out, and so on and so forth. So the more fire we have in an environment, the less fire-sensitive plants we have, and the more fire-tolerant plants we have. Plants don't need fire. When I did 101 plant ecology, I hate to think how long ago, at this university, the 5 essential requirements, you know, carbon, nutrients, air, water and space, not fire. Plants don't need fire. Fire will actually stress them, or it is fatal. It is yeah, at the least it's a stress, and at the worst it's fatal. So things like epicomic shoots, it's what eucalypts do when they're stressed. So we've just got to, for my mind, when I'm talking about this and interacting with other people on this subject, I try not to say, oh, it's an adaptation to fire. It's something they're really good at doing, but it's not actually something that they've evolved to respond to fire. Similarly with dormancy, there's a whole lot of cues that break dormancy. Fire is one of them. But there's many others as well. Hard seed coats are broken by moisture, photoperiod, fluctuating temperatures, animals foraging, digging, crunching seed coats and so on and so forth. Fire, yeah, for sure, if you burn, you might get a flush of orchids and you might get a whole lot of Banksia seedlings coming up. And that might be a good thing. It's a different cue, and whether those seedlings establish to reproductive maturity is a whole lot of other things, nothing to do with fire. It's whether you get that conjunction of water and nutrients and light and everything to enable those plants to grow. So fire is such a powerful thing, it can make things happen, but because it's become a human activity as opposed to pre-human, it was a very rare occurrence, it's a very powerful force that we're playing with. Oh, my favourite, you might have heard me talk about this, fuel. Fuel, oh, it's organic matter, it's beautiful bark and microorganisms and leaf litter and all sorts of things. And the more we talk about fuel, the more I think the general population just think, oh, it's fuel. Fuel's something you put in your motor car, or litter. I don't know if anybody remembers a CFS advertisement a few years ago on the front page of the Courier, and they had a little seedling with its little cotyledon growths out the front, and next to it, the caption underneath was, next year's fuel. And it was just a tiny little plant. And I wanted to rewrite next century's soil generator, because that's what plants are doing. They're decomposing and growing and decomposing and inputting organic matter into the ground, into the ecosystem, and creating soil. And soil is what, you know, the authorities are telling us is we need to look after for not just the ecological niche of plants and animals, but our own ecological niche. So there's a question here about the terminology again. So this was from the website, junior website, just copied a little paragraph here. I've just rewritten it with organic matter instead of fuel, just to see what it looked like. So fire, as I mentioned, was relatively rare before humans, and then humans came along like really, really late in the evolutionary clock and started to do all sorts of things. Please glance over that quickly because there's not a lot of time, but I love this quote from 1931, it was from 1939, and I think there's quite often a lot of reference to how people love to play with fire, seem to be doing something, and so on. Just back to the idea about terminology, the problem with some of this language and these untested assumptions and misleading language is that it justifies doing certain things. And the general community, not brainwashed or hoodwinked, but they believe what they hear because they think, you know, the scientists or the authorities have said so. So we have to be really careful with the language we use. So it's a human act, but what I wanted to say now, since humans have come, it's a human activity. It's something not like, you know, floods and cyclones and tsunamis that we wait for and they're irregular and erratic. We actually have this in the palm of our hand and we're using it. And it's just a really powerful force, I think, that we have to be really careful. Aboriginal people obviously used it for resource management. We're using it more now to fight fire with fire, but it's a pretty blunt instrument and requires a lot of caution. The expression like playing with fire, you know, it's the definition to do something dangerous or risky. The costs, and I'm going to have to go really quickly now because the costs were things like, I wanted to talk about, there are costs obviously. Lessons from Tasmania. I thought this was really useful just to mention what's happened in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years actually around Australia. There have been some really massive fires. The conclusion is that this isn't just any old event, that it was definitely related to global warming and climate change, and I think that's got relevance for us here in South Australia. We've only got a small amount of our vegetation left in the Mount Lofty Ranges, and not a lot of it is in good shape, and it's one of 10 biological hotspots in Australia, and really that means that the whole thing is one great big environmental asset. It's getting drier, it's already subjected to stress, and I won't get along to talking about it, but I wanted to just throw out the need for perhaps a rethink about recommended fire frequencies. These help managers work out how often you need to burn the bush. But things are changing so quickly. I think it's really risky to attach those fire regimes, and maybe we need to relook at them now in a changing world, in a world where fires are becoming more frequent. And the idea that we need a more nuanced approach comes up again and again, like the landscape level fire, landscape level change. You know, playing God with the environment, really. Like, I mean, we have plus or minus whole landscapes going out if you get it wrong. And in this era where things are changing so fast, it's a lot drier, it's a lot warmer, we're moving towards a more fire-tolerant vegetation. Should we do a more nuanced approach? Should we be on the ground, as Aboriginal people were, following fires, understanding that the landscape has within it whole lots of little niches and little areas of pockets of interesting things happening? Listen to the experts. Owen Price has come out, people would know this if they're working in the area of prescription burning. There's been a lot of evidence now saying that the influence of the effect of prescription burning is questionable at best. Just flicking over this. The stakes are high. Species don't necessarily come and go, they go and go. And the solutions, a nuanced approach, case-specific, introducing native wildlife to reduce the fuel. They turned it over and did a lot of that, helped a lot of those decomposition processes. Using fire for weed management. Instead of burning the bush, let's go and burn those degraded areas and have a win-win approach. Restore the vegetation and get rid of the weeds at the same time. So I like this quote from Jamie Kirkpatrick. It was published in The Conversation. His ideas after some of these big fires in Tassie need much more planned burning for ecological purposes. Prescription burning is actually, and they talk about prescription and ecological burning. Someone in a meeting just recently said we only do 2% of ecological burns. They're all ecological burns. You don't have a burn without vegetation. A non-ecological burn is a tyre fire out at Wingfield. Every burn is an ecological burn, and I think if we start to look at it like that, then we can actually measure the effects, and ecologists can come more into the picture and more into the space about more widespread risk management. And solutions, oh, this is a bit out there, but I'll just leave it with this. There is another suggestion that at the moment life is over property and property is over environment. But hang on, this is our environment, this is our natural capital, this is our ecological niche. Buildings can be rebuilt. Environments can't necessarily be rebuilt. And so there is, you know, I'm just putting this out there because this was a quote, that it's easy, maybe we should look at life over property, environment over property. Is that the right way around? Yeah. Because the environment isn't something that we can just rebuild as we can a shed or a house. Okay, thanks very much.